How to Chess College, Humanities 4 through Film Studies. How was your weekend? How was all of that? We are moving fast now because we're approaching the midterms, which we're going to have a quiz. I'll post that in a day or so. Be watching that film I showed you. I talked about it last time, Raging Bulls, Easy Rider and Raging Bulls. That's 2 movies, folks. Easy Rider and Raging Bulls by Martin Scorsese. And the point of the documentary is to show you how that 12-year period or so was what a lot of people call the last golden era of Hollywood movies, where the auteur took over the studios, because the auteur, which is the author of his own work, was making strong personal films that had a lot to do with what was going on in the culture, which is number 1, Vietnam War, number 2, the Civil Rights Movement, women's movement, assassinations of political figures, and racial unrest. The country is being ripped apart. And so that's when these film students jumped the wall in Hollywood and got to make movies and made maybe the 100 of the greatest films we've ever seen in a 10-year period of a certain type of film. And it all stopped with the invention of the Blockbuster, which is the era we're still in 45 years later after Jaws and then your beloved Star Wars. Then it was all about mass consumption of bigger, better marketing, commercial, simplistic stories, melodramas. And we're still in that mode to this day. But before that mode got going, there were some films that changed how we looked at films, how we looked at the genre. I'm going to talk about one genre right now, which is the Western. Now, in the late 60s, a lot of young people were raised on television. They're raised on Westerns on television, like The Rifleman and Gunsmoke and Bonanza and Big Valley and so many more. The Westerns we were inundated with them, that generation, which is the baby boomers, which were born after World War II. But now rock and roll comes in, Beatles, Stones, Jimi Hendrix, Cream, all the Motown bands, Jeff Snare playing the hippie bands from San Francisco, Grateful Dead, and the kids kind of put the Westerns behind them because what was facing them was getting a draft notice that could send you to a war that nobody believed in, that got over 50,000 young men killed. We, of course, killed a lot more of them, over 1 million. That's Vietnamese people, Cambodian people, Laotian people, because we bombed the holy hell out of their country fighting communism. We have John F. Kennedy to thank for that little intrusion. LBJ was the president, and he could not figure out how to get out of Vietnam. He kept the war going, and so he actually quit. He didn't run again for president. He was a single-term president who only ran once. He had been replaced. He was the vice president when Kennedy was killed, so he became the president then, but then he only ran again once. And then he couldn't figure out how to get out of the Vietnam War. And in those days, we had very few channels of television, just 3, ABC, NBC, CBS. And the news was a half hour a day, not 24 hours of news, what we have now. And we had these trusted newscasters who would look into the camera, and they were journalists who'd been around the world. They reported in World War II, Korea, trusted journalists, male for the most part, and one of them was Walter Cronkite. Well, Walter Cronkite came out against the Vietnam War, said it was unwinnable. And that was rare for a newscaster to say because that's giving their opinion. And you're not supposed to do that as newscasters. This is the news the way it used to be. Let the people decide their opinion. But now, of course, you either watch Fox or CNN, and that's all they do is give their opinions, right? We know where they stand. And that's why you watch the channel. So the idea of being partial without giving your opinion is a thing of the past. But Walter Cronkite was so trusted that when he came out and said that, LBJ said, I've lost the country if I've lost Cronkite. That's how powerful Walter Cronkite was. Trusted newscaster that we all were glued to our televisions every night for a half hour to listen to his newscast. The other channels had other people that were just as trusted. Huntley and Brinkley were on the other channel, and I can't remember all the other ones. But these guys were on the news for 40, 50 years on television. They're early television pioneers. Be that as it may, LBJ didn't know what to do, so he dropped out, and Nixon was the next president to get elected. And he said he's going to end the war, but of course he didn't. It went on for another 10 years, and more guys got killed because he was a hawk, and he had a hawk generals who thought they could win the hearts and minds of the people in Vietnam, which is not true. That didn't happen, and so we bombed the holy living hell out of them instead. Just like what's going on in the Ukraine with Russia. They're not winning the hearts and minds of the Ukrainians, so what do? Destroy everything. Okay, so history is always repeating itself, folks. We don't change, technology does. So there was some radical filmmakers who were experienced filmmakers coming up through television. Sam Peckinpah was one of them who started in doing theater, actually, and plays, and then he graduated into television, and he created the legendary series called The Rifleman. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. And so he had some cachet in Hollywood. He had some credence. And so he was given a couple movies to direct. Well, he was kind of an honorary character and slow director who knew how to spend money but got results, folks. His movies are considered brilliant, but the studios felt he was costing them too much money. So essentially, he was fired for a couple of prestigious films. But he made a comeback with a film called The Wild Bunch. Now, this is a Western, is a revision of Westerns. And up until now, the Westerns are always filled with heroes and villains. This, you weren't sure who were the heroes or who were the villains because everybody's essentially bad in it. There's this level of being bad. The Wild Bunch are bank robbers who, the opening the movie, which I'm going to post some footage of it on in Canvas. Check it out if you would. Opens up with a bank robbery by a bunch of well-oiled, well-planned out robbers who are dressed in army uniforms. It would all taking place in the early 1900s, so it's modern times, folks. During the Mexican Revolution, down on the Tex-Mex border, and they get into a boatload of trouble, and there's a huge, gigantic slaughter of a shootout at the beginning of the movie, and it shocked and awed everybody in the audience because they were supposed to be the good guys, and yet they're shooting up innocent people to rob the bank. Well, you follow the movie, and it's about loyalty and ethics and how do you stick to an idea, how to stick to a friend, and have some sort of code of honor. And so that's who we follow, the Wild Bunch. They're killers, but they're not psychopathic murderers. They only shoot who shoots at them. Okay, so as the movie goes along, there's lots of ins and outs. It ends with a 6 or 7 minute shootout at the end of the movie, which is referred to as the bloody porch sequence because it all takes place on a hacienda, a huge porch, and hundreds of people are killed. And there's a lot of, it was a new sort of violence that we never seen before. We saw the bullet holes. We saw bullet holes go in and we saw them go out. That was new. And how he did that was simple. They would put a squib. A squib is a packet of blood underneath the collar or shirt or whatever you're putting it. And it has a packet of blood, fake blood, folks. And they run a line, electrical line, to someone off camera who's operating it. And so when the bullet hits you, he hits a button and it explodes. Well, Peckinpah's idea was to have the bullet go out the back also. And he also wanted to see material go out the back. And so they would put hamburger in the blood packet on the back. So you see the bullet go in, goes out the back, and you see some flesh and bloods and brains going out the back with it. Well, we've never seen this before. Then he filmed it in slow motion. That was not done in those days. It had been done a little bit in Bonnie and Clyde, and that's where Peckinpah really got inspired. The ending of Bonnie and Clyde has a very dramatic, massive killing at in the end of Bonnie and Clyde, actually. And some of it's in slow motion. Well, to do slow motion, you have to. It's easy now. You just push a button on your cell phone. But in those days, you had to speed the camera up, the film camera. The faster the camera rolls, the faster. It's not what you think. It has to go through there really fast, and that makes it slow. The image is slowed down when you screen it. If you want the images to go fast, you slow the camera down. And normal camera rate in those days was 24 frames a second. Peckinpah would have a 50-40 rate of camera action. So you're not only seeing the blood packets and hearing the bullets coming out of the weapons, you're also seeing it in slow motion. Never been done before like this. And it was a game changer. Most dramatic ending of a movie in probably the film history. And after that, the floodgates were open to a new form of violence on movies until it got to be to the ridiculous place we are now, which is sometimes you look at a John Wick movie and it's nothing but shootouts and blood packets. And that's all computer generated image, but still takes a lot of planning. And so when Peckinpah's movie came out, they called it a ballet of violence. And he was nicknamed Bloody Sam. Bloody Sam Peckinpah. He hated that name, by the way. He said he was trying to show the violence being so bad and disgusting that no one would ever want to do it again. It had the opposite effect. It looked really kind of wonderful. And it's hard to explain why that is, but there's an exhilaration in it. So it had the opposite effect. So then now a new term was starting around this area called an anti-Western. And why is it an anti-Western? Well, because there are no black hat villains. There's no white hat heroes. Everybody is shades of gray. The West is not what we thought it was. It's complicated, really complicated. These are adult stories. when that movie came out, it was rated X for violence. He toned it down a little and later got an R rating so he could make more money. But it's considered a masterpiece, not just by me, folks. Read about it. And from then on, he made several films, wonderful films later. He tried to go nonviolence, but the audience weren't showing up for it, so he depended on the violence to keep his career going. And he ended very sadly, an alcoholic and a drug addict, and dying early, 58 years old, after directing some of the most savage, brilliant cinema we've ever seen. Pat Garrett, Billy the Kid, Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, Straw Dogs. Watch those, folks. They're all out there, but you better be prepared for some disturbing imagery. And I don't mean disturbing like a slasher film. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about human emotion that's pushed to the very edge of our humanity. And that's why it reinvented the Western. During the same time, there was another Western came out the same year called Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Maybe you've seen it. It's a happy-go-lucky, very entertaining movie directed by George Roy Hill, who was a happy-go-lucky, entertaining director, starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford. It's a historical good buddy film. Has its share of violence in it also, but it's kind of done in a light way, humorous way, and they put a modern soundtrack on it. A big hit song came out of that movie called "Rain Drops" or "Keep Falling on My Head." What is that song doing in that movie? Obviously, it wasn't the music of the day, whereas Peckinpah used authentic Mexican music of the times. Actually, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid is about similar outlaws they're bad, but they're not as bad as everybody else. And they were called the Hole in the Wall Gang. Well, Peckinpah based his Wild Bunch on a real gang called the Hole in the Wall Gang. And he did a fictitious story, but he never used that term. But George Roy Hill did. And this movie was a huge box office success. You know, how can you go wrong with the charms of Paul Newman, Robert Redford, and Catherine Ross as the beautiful girlfriend? And we have a great soundtrack and just so entertaining. It's a feel-good movie, even though it ends with their deaths. Very artistically done. Peckinpah hated this movie because he said that's a fantasy. Well, he was probably right. But it was the big number one at the box office. Wild Bunch did very good, but nothing like this kind of business. So these movies came out the same year. Well, what's going on with the Western? Vietnam War is going, civil rights are going. College kids aren't that interested in Westerns anymore. But the public really responded to these two movies. It was like the last gasp of a genre that had been popular for 100 years. From silent movies to John Ford movies to John Wayne movies to all of them, to all the television Westerns. But it had come to its close. By 1970, there was no Westerns on TV. It became more social realism. And because the kids who were fighting the draft and social justice really didn't have much want or desire to see people on horseback. Okay. And so, along about 72 or so, another movie came out called McCabe and Mrs. Miller. And this was by Robert Altman, starring Julie. That's horrible. It'll come to me in a second. I should write this stuff down. Julie Christie and the great Warren Beatty. And as the star of it, he was the guy who did Bonnie and Clyde, produced it and starred in it. Well, by now he's really got a lot of cachet in Hollywood, Warren does, and it's hard to direct him, and him and Altman argued the whole time. And it's a dark Western about a guy, McCabe, who comes to a mining town way up in the middle of nowhere, and he essentially wants to gamble, and he starts a whorehouse to make money off the miners. Well, these other guys move in, they want part of the action, and yes, the violence ensues. It's an adult Western with adult themes. The women all aren't beautiful, they're prostitutes. There's not very many women in these mining camps, folks, so they have to get what they could get. And the miners are all filthy and living in tents and shacks, and they're gold mining. So a town arose around this gold mine. Well, it was considered another closing the door of the traditional Western, another anti hero, which was Warren Beatty. He wasn't a great guy. He was just a guy who made his living off of gambling and prostitution. He wasn't a killer, he wasn't a mad, but he could take care of himself if he had to. So here we have three or four westerns during this budding era of the auteur filmmaker. That documentary I've asked you to watch covers some of these things, not in detail though. And it was slamming the door on the old Hollywood and opening the door to the new Hollywood. And it was like these directors were saying, game on. And everything from then for the next 10 years was game on. And the films that came out of the 1970s changed the course of Hollywood cinema. And then the door was slammed shut when the blockbuster is invented. And that's in that documentary, by the way. I want you guys to watch. Hollywood had lost its way. They didn't know what would make money. And these auteur directors who'd all gone to film school seemed to have the answer. And so Hollywood studio heads listened. These revolutionary films came out of the Hollywood system. This is long before Sundance and independent films. These were mainstream films, mainstream directors. Peter Bogdanovich, Hal Ashby, Francis Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Terrence Malick. No women, of course, sorry. And during this era, I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm going to do a whole segment on this next week. There was a movement with African American filmmakers, and yes, it was called blaxploitation. And we're going to be getting into that next week. You're going to love it. That was happening during this time too, where black audiences were going, who do we relate to in these Hollywood movies? It's full of white people. Are people we can relate to? Well, some writer and directors and smart people came along and said, we're going to make movies for a black audience. And it shook the entire industry up again, because they found that not only did black audiences dig this stuff, white audiences love it. And when there's money to be made, Hollywood comes in. In a way, they're really cowardly. They have to come in knowing that the money's already been made the hard way by game-changing directors and writers who took a risk that Hollywood was unable to do. And that, as they say, is the rest of that story. And I'll continue that story next week. Story of Film continues. Look at that documentary, because in a day or so, I'm going to post a quiz about the documentary that I posted. It won't be due till next week, so don't worry. You'll have a couple days to do the quiz. More about that later, but do watch the documentary, Easy Rider Raging Bulls, or flunk the quiz. That's all simple as that. It's all based on that documentary. You need to watch it and take notes. And I'm going to give you a clue to it. If you listen to this whole lecture, you'll hear the clue. If you don't listen to this much of the lecture, you won't get the clue. That's the problem with not listening to my lectures. It's going to be an essay questions, 3 of them. And it's going to be a lot to do with what's going on in the country that's reflecting in these movies, and how are these movies reflecting what's going on in the country? That's a hint. And on that story, remember, everything is cinema. See you next week when the story film continues.